Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Net Zero Compare podcast. Today, we are joined by Bronwyn Reid, author, speaker, and founder of The Gap Effect. Bronwyn works with organizations navigating complex environments where regulation, ESG expectations, and risk management can easily become overwhelming for leadership teams. Her work focuses on helping companies identify operational gaps between strategy and execution, particularly in areas where compliance requirements, sustainability goals, and real world business pressures collide. In this conversation, we will explore why sustainability initiatives often struggle to move from commitments to implementation, how organizations can better manage regulatory pressure, and what leaders can do to make ESG strategies more practical and actionable. Bronwyn, welcome to Net Zero Compare podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here and thank you for inviting me along.
My pleasure. Bronwyn, to start, could you briefly introduce your background and explain what led you to focus your work on the gap between strategy, regulation, and real-world implementation?
Okay. My history is being a small supplier to very large companies, Carol. I've seen the good, the bad, and the very, very ugly of what happens in that gap when small businesses and big businesses try to do business together. Basically, they have a couple of problems in communicating. That the same problems, but each is looking at them from their own point of view. So we get a communication issue there. We can also then get into the difference between the power of the two parties. So that's been my life's work. That's what I've learned about. That's what I write about, and that's what I speak about. Now we've introduced this next thing into that gap, ESG expectations. And in the case of this particular podcast that we're talking about today, the obligations towards net zero. So that's one more thing that SMEs are small businesses are trying to struggle with, get their head around, because they know that their large customers have to be dealing with it. So that, in summary, is where I'm currently working.
And many organizations today, I think, have strong sustainability commitments on paper, but translating those commitments into operational change is often where the difficulty begins. So that's a great one. And thanks for that introduction.
That's fine.
And from your experience working with companies, where do sustainability or ESG strategies most commonly break down between planning and execution? I'm asking because that gap between intention and then implementation seems to be a recurring issue across many industries.
A strategy statement and even strategy actions by a large company doing what they either are required by legislation to do or by fulfilling their social responsibilities and their other environmental responsibilities doesn't always translate into practical things to do for a small business. And that's where the breakdown comes. So just because there's a strategy set by a very large company doesn't mean that's going to actually work in practice. Somebody in the middle, usually the small or medium business, has to put the infrastructure into place to make that strategy work. Yeah, so it's for the small business, that now becomes an infrastructure problem. How do I actually put this into place? And to be perfectly honest, as you know, we are all learning along this path of getting to net zero. We have different standards in different countries. We have different standards within our own countries. It can all be tremendously confusing. And that's where small businesses start to really struggle. They don't even know what they're supposed to be doing. And that's where the work that I do comes in. I step in and try and ease the confusion and bring a little calm into the conversation so they can actually start. And that's the main point for small and medium businesses, Carol. Start. Try and overcome the overwhelm, but actually get started.
Yes, this initial phase is always the most problematic, as we know. It's always difficult to start. And also, if I understood correctly, given your experience, does it mean that you're focusing and you're only working with small and medium enterprises, or if your focus is broader?
Of course, that's my specialty, small and medium enterprises, but you can't solve a communication gap by only talking to one side of the equation. So I do like to work with large companies as well, helping them to understand how they can better meet their social, environmental, and governance expectations through understanding the smaller suppliers in their supply chains and helping them understand how the smaller suppliers think, how they operate, and what it means to them to meet the objectives of their customers, i.e., the big corporation.
Thank you very
Because
much for
usually
the
they just
clarification.
don't know. They just don't know.
Got it. And thank you again for that clarification. And now, a growing number of companies are facing expanding regulatory requirements all across the world, as we know. And they are related to climate disclosure, supply chains, and ESG reporting. Why do you think do these frameworks often create confusion or fatigue inside organizations?
Well, I referred to it just in that previous answer that we still have different standards applying across the world. And in Australia, there's different standards as well. What does a small business do? Where do they go? Well, what do they look at? What are they implementing? That's where the confusion begins. We're not blaming anybody. It's just, this is, as you say, the first phase is the most difficult, and we all just have to do the best we can to get through this first phase. I actually sat next to a gentleman on a plane yesterday whose company works with carbon credits in Australia. We were having a conversation, and he gave me this wonderful analogy. Back in the 1800s and even back into ancient civilizations, we have always wanted to deal with or needed to deal with water sanitation and sewage sanitation. This really got going in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and we've now had legislation. We have worldwide systems of sewage and sanitation. We're now undertaking the same thing, but this time it's air sanitation. And I thought that was a wonderful analogy for what we're going through now.
I also love examples and analogies because they help us to understand even super complex issues. So thanks for that. And I think for many teams, the challenge is not just understanding the regulations, but also figuring out how to operationalize them. Would you agree with that?
100%. And this is where I like to work with small businesses, where we can start with just the simple things. Now, if you look at a small business worldwide, very often, generally, a small business, particularly a family-owned business, is well embedded in its community. It's the business that will support the local school, perhaps the owner of the business is also the trainer of the under 9 football team or the netball team, and somebody takes the uniforms home and launders them during the week. They're usually, as I said, embedded in their communities very, very well. So the idea is to get those things that they're already doing and codify them. And that can usually just be step one. Just step one. You're already doing it. Let's record it. And if possible, let's measure it. Step one, tick.
Even small actions matter, and baby steps.
100%. I like to use the example of an exponential curve. If you start and just do those little tiny things, the 1% improvements, each one is building on the one from the previous day or the previous week or the previous month. And inevitably you get that wonderful exponential curve. And I do try to explain to businesses that you can't start up the end of the exponential curve. You must start down here. But if you don't start, you will never, ever achieve what you are trying to achieve.
True. And also they need to have a proper time management, because as we know, especially with the exponential curve, at the beginning, you need to invest a lot of, most probably capital, but time. And then you see maybe a little bit of progress. But as the time goes, with the same amount of time, you'll see a big increment of progress down the road, right?
100%. The other side of that too, Carol, is, and I will acknowledge my friend Simon Bowen, who introduced me to this model, if you like. If we don't start now at the beginning of that exponential curve, you can slip and
And be
start
left
going
behind.
on the downwards exponential curve. And the longer you stay down on the downward exponential curve, the harder it is to catch up when you have to catch up.
Very well said. And when companies are dealing with multiple regulatory frameworks at the same time, so what are the most common mistakes leaders make when trying to respond to these pressures?
So for a lot of small and medium businesses, Carol, net zero or ESG requirements don't arrive on their doorstep as a strategy goal or an internal compunction to be net zero. That's just the honest truth, because most of them are trying to survive day to day and dealing with everything else they have to deal with. It arrives as a requirement from a customer. It arrives as a request for a report or a mandatory reporting requirement in some form. So they will normally, well, always respond to that particular request. So they're not doing a scoping survey of which particular standard they should look to follow. Their focus will be narrow. It will be, what do I have to do to answer this particular request from this particular client?
That's a good one. Exactly what you've just said. What should I do? Because from our experience, when we talk and work with organizations, sometimes you can see that they reacted quickly to external pressure, but unfortunately, that does not always lead to effective long-term solutions. So this question, what should I do? What is the problem? That's the key essential here.
Yes, I was having. I mentioned the gentleman I was sitting next to on the plane yesterday, and he was saying exactly the same thing. His company mostly deals with carbon sequestration and carbon farming, and he's seeing that a lot, where large organizations just ignore, and then all of a sudden the requirement will turn up and they'll be in all sorts of pain.
Or sometimes they only treat sustainability, environment related issues as a marketing tool, unfortunately. That's another
Correct.
pitfall.
Yes, I was at the Global Speakers Conference in Cairns in Australia 2 weeks ago, and I was talking with a lady from a university in Singapore, and her specialty is teaching strategy to larger organizations. And when we started talking about ESG, she said, "Oh, I really do need to find out more about this because we don't teach any of this in our courses. And I need to put that, add in that to our courses." And in the nicest possible way, I said, ESG is not an add-in. We can't treat it as a plug-in anymore. It's not something that we just, let's just add that on the side later on. ESG now has to be a central tenet of strategy, particularly in large companies, because that's where it trickles down into the smaller suppliers in their supply chain. And unfortunately, that's where we still are in a lot of cases, looking at ESG as just this little add-on thing that we plug into the side. And it's not the way it needs to be approached.
Exactly. It's way too much more complex than that. In
Mm.
your work, you talk about identifying gaps inside organizations. If you could tell us what types of gaps tend to appear most often when companies attempt to implement sustainability initiatives.
I can think of so many. So the first one is what I've already mentioned, Carol, the gap, the communication gap between big companies and their smaller suppliers. And that's really where my work started, is helping to resolve that gap so that more small and medium enterprises can participate in those large supply chains, because there are so many benefits, and I don't need to tell you all about that. So there's that communication gap. There's also the gap between the expectations that the law has now, that customers have, that employees have, that financiers have, and what a company can actually do. I'm sure I don't need to go through all of that with you and your audience, that this huge expectation gap that companies do need to close if they're going to get employees, get suppliers, get finance, etc., etc. There's another gap in capability, and I guess way back in the dark ages, that was my very first thing that I was doing with small businesses, was helping them to build the capabilities that they needed to confidently and successfully apply to be a part of these large supply chains. So bringing that back to net zero, often they don't have the capability to go ahead and implement a net zero plan. And that's why I come back to that simple exponential curve. Let's start at point 0, point 1, and build the capability gradually.
And what kind of capability are we talking here about? Is it the lack of tools, the lack of funding, or the lack of awareness within the organization?
All of the above.
Oh, okay.
All of the above. Um, all business leaders, particularly in this current environment, are stretched. They are all stretched for time. Many of them are also stretched for money. We're struggling with strategy. We're struggling to understand what's happening in the world. We're struggling with what on earth is going to happen in our supply chains. The situation is changing from day to day. But that's where it's all of those capabilities that I try to address. But again, I stress that my approach is not, here's a whole big list of things you must do, but deleting the overwhelm. And it's the same in risk management, building risk management capability in small organizations. Start small.
Exactly. And understanding those gaps is often the first step toward making sustainability strategies more realistic within the organization. So win-win at the end of the road.
Yes, 100%. And that's the work that I want to progress doing with larger organizations, is helping them understand how that whole section of their supply chain thinks, works, operates, the constraints they have. One example I often use, Carol, is that a small supplier may have been given a contract with a 10, 20, $30 million public liability clause. But in reality, they're just supplying the paper coffee cups for the lunchroom. That's a massive gap in, and probably the person in the large company procurement hasn't even ever thought of it. That, well, perhaps the person supplying the coffee cups doesn't need $10 million worth of public liability insurance.
As you mentioned at the very beginning, even focusing on little tiny stuff will make the difference down the road.
Absolutely.
Now, many companies publish ambitious climate targets or sustainability roadmaps. From your perspective, what separates organizations that successfully deliver on these commitments from those that struggle?
Oh, that's a very big question, huh? I sometimes feel that it's something that we can feel as consumers. I think of some of the customers that I deal with. So my actual real job, Carol, is I own an environmental consultancy and have done so for 30 years. So we deal with a lot of very large organizations in our environmental consultancy. And a lot of them are the biggest mining names in the world, the BHPs, the Rio Tintos, etc. We can, when we deal with them, feel whether their commitment is genuine or not. I wish I could put it a little bit more objectively, but you get the sense when you talk to them, when you have the quarterly meetings. I would have to say that BHP here in Australia is certainly amongst the best in their genuine commitment. Some of the others, not so noteworthy. Yeah, I really wish I could say, give you a definitive list, and maybe I need to go away and think about that and create a list. The other thing is that the regulatory authorities in Australia here are getting pretty hot on picking up greenwashing claims. There's been several prosecutions.
I get it. I liked your answer. It was very diplomatic. I'll put it this way, because to me, it also seems that governance and internal alignment often play a way bigger role than technology alone, unfortunately. And customers, as you said, customers can feel it.
Yes, yes.
Another challenge we often hear about is the internal alignment that we've just both mentioned. Sustainability teams may be pushing initiatives while finance, procurement, or operations team have different priorities, and it's usually the case. So how can an organization bridge these internal divides in your view?
It's a long-term thing, Carol, and I'm sure I am not telling you anything there. I just mentioned one of Australia's biggest mining companies. They have been on a track, not just of environmental, but of social and governance responsibility for well over, probably closer to 2 decades, which of course comes back to that building it one step at a time. You simply cannot change the culture of a worldwide organization, or even an organization the size of mine, very, very quickly. It's It has to be gradual. It has to come from the top. And as I said before, these things have to be built into strategy. They are not a plug-in. If you treat it as a plug-in, you're going to get the pushback from procurement, the pushback from the production guys. It has to come from the top. And it's a long-term commitment. So we can't all of a sudden change our organizational culture to be all environmentally friendly and socially responsible and net zero overnight.
Changing mentality, behavior patterns. Yeah, that's a long process. I do agree.
Reward systems within the company.
Yes.
Tie reward systems to behavior and outcomes. That's the
Yeah.
fastest way.
Got it. Looking at the broader ESG landscape today, do you see organizations becoming more pragmatic about sustainability, or are many still approaching it primarily as a reporting exercise?
Okay, let's put it this way. It's an awful lot better than it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when I first started writing and speaking about this stuff. There's still laggards, absolutely, for sure. But at least now these topics are part of everyday conversations. So we read about this in the newspapers every day. We read about it in our business briefings, in our company conferences, etc. So at least we're talking about it now. And most people know what ESG actually means. Whereas 5 years ago, I would start talking about ESG and inevitably somebody would say, what does that mean? So we have made enormous progress. What makes me very sad, though, is that there are those people like you, like me, who've been talking about it for a very long time. If we hadn't had that pushback for well nigh 20 years, how much further ahead would we be on the E and the S and the G if we hadn't had the sustained pushback from politicians, from certain sectors of industry? So to summarize that answer, yes, there are still holdouts or laggards, but at least we've got to the point where most people understand what ESG actually means.
Over here, this is something we hear from the most of our guests, that it's not perfect at the moment, but it's far better than it used to be. So there's a hope down the road. Perfect. And the shift
100%.
from reporting to real operational change, I think it seems to be one of the key issues nowadays that many companies are grappling with. At least we can see that the awareness is.
Yeah, progress beats perfection in summary.
Yes, exactly. And for executives who feel overwhelmed by regulatory pressure and ESG expectations, what practical steps can they take to regain clarity and focus?
Seek help. I always say that when maybe 10 years ago, if you put ESG or sustainability consultant into the LinkedIn search bar, you didn't get many results. Now, if you put that into the search bar in LinkedIn, there are hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people, experts, people who can help you out there. The biggest message I have is the one I've repeated over and over and over during our conversation, Carol, is don't resist the overwhelm and seek help. I mean, there's plenty of us out there. You listen to your podcast, there's plenty of people out there to help you get through this. You employ an accountant to do your financial requirements and reporting to the government. Treat this the same. Get some expertise into your organization. Don't try and do it all yourself.
Well said. Finally, looking ahead over the next, let's say, few years, so 5, 10 years, what changes do you expect in how companies approach sustainability, regulation, and risk management?
The risk management one's a very interesting one. That's a rabbit hole I can definitely go down with you at sometime, Carl. My belief there is that the risk management industry has made itself almost completely impermeable to anyone other than somebody in the risk management industry with jargon, et cetera, et cetera. So I actually wrote a book on that called Small Company, Big Crisis, helping small businesses to navigate risk management, understand it, and put it into
We'll
place.
add the link in our article to the book.
Okay, thank you. I think over the next 5 to 10 years, I will go back to the analogy that gentleman gave me on the plane, that we do not question water and sewerage sanitation infrastructure, rules, regulations. We no longer empty our sewers into the rivers and the oceans. This will become the same. We will sit here in 10 years' time and think, why were we not doing that before? I was at a conference in Singapore, and I was chairing a panel, and we were sitting up on the stage at the conference, and they had given us all plastic bottles of water, and I used the analogy that there is no way that we, as conference attendees, would walk up on the stage, sit on the chairs, and light up a cigarette and have a smoke. That's just not a thing. Proposal was that in 5 to 10 years, that will be the same as walking on stage with a plastic water bottle. You will be just thrown out of the auditorium practically. And I believe that our pursuit of environmental sustainability will become the same.
Your example illustrates perfectly the problem that we are currently facing. Sustainability conference, and still they are distributing water in plastic water bottles.
Correct.
As if it would be that difficult to, figure out some other means of water procurement.
I know. But small steps, Carol. We just have to go.
Baby steps. I do agree. And what signals should business leaders watch to understand where the landscape is heading now?
That's a very difficult question. And this is another conversation I had with the gentleman on the plane yesterday who was into carbon farming. It is incredibly confusing. I can speak for the Australian experience. I really can't speak for
Yes,
other
please.
countries at the moment. But if people would like to invite me to come to their country to speak about this, I'm perfectly happy to learn about it. I think our governments could do more to make the path a bit easier to explain and do their part in demystifying, I guess. Here in Australia, we have state governments that some of them do a lot of work in small business development, helping small businesses and encouraging them, training small business owners. But that part of it hasn't come into that yet. And they do a lot of leadership and strategy planning and financial management and all that stuff. But I still haven't seen the whole ESG conversation come in at that level of development for small businesses. So I think that would be a very, very good start. Again, it's the whole about melding this part of business management into the center of the business, not a plug-in that we just attach on the side.
Perfect example again. And before we wrap up, is there anything important that we didn't touch on, but you feel is important to share or worth mentioning to our audience?
I guess by implication, My message to the other people who inhabit these very large and critical supply chains that we have. Heavens above, there's a perfect example going on in the world just at the moment with interruptions to supply chain for oil and fuel. That while big companies and governments are dealing with these, worldwide, very large supply chain issues, just a reminder that if you do not bring along small and regional businesses with you, net zero is not going to happen. It has to be a whole of business approach, a whole of society approach, not just the few at the top.
Perfect. And let's finish on that note. Bronwyn, thank you very much for sharing your perspective today. It was a very interesting discussion about the challenges organizations face when navigating sustainability, regulation, and operational change.
Thank you very much. Very much enjoyed our conversation.
My pleasure again. And thanks to everyone who joined us for this episode of the Net Zero Compare podcast. If you found this conversation useful, you can explore more interviews, insights, and practical resources at netzerocompare.com. We will also include links to Bronwyn's work and her books along the website in this episode description. Thanks again for listening, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.